Get started on the next chapter here now, which is the endocrine system. As we kind of saw before, I was gonna originally this would have been on the second test, but just because of everything that was going on here, it made more sense to move this one back a little bit. To me, this one's a little bit more difficult than the integumentary to kind of work through. So because of that, I figured I'd pull it back a little bit, give us a little bit more time to get through it, because there is a few more slides and a few more difficult things to take a look at on this one. So the endocrine system to me is a lot like the nervous system in that it's doing a lot of command and control of other systems. So on this one, we're going to be looking at a little bit of what hormones are made by which parts of this, kind of again looking at the glands, discussing what the structures look like in there, what are some of the different cell types that are in there. Outside of that, the pituitary gland, we'll look at the thyroid gland, we'll look at some of these other ones like the parathyroid and the adrenal glands. Again, having an idea of what layer on some of these is doing what and what hormones those are making, what are the actions of those hormones. So again, it's going to be about 5 to 6 different tissue types, along with a few different cell types within those. So the endocrine system, what it really is it's again one of the 2 command and control systems of the body. This one is using hormones into the bloodstream to again try to regulate what a lot of the other systems are doing. So again, these are endocrine glands, meaning they secrete into the bloodstream. They don't have a duct. That would be an exocrine gland, which we've talked about when we talked about epithelium in general. And again, because blood goes everywhere in the body, this is almost like a body-wide broadcast. So these hormones go into the tissues, they're going to travel everywhere, and again, those cells that have receptors to them are going to react to that. The classical, like it says here, endocrine system kind of hits on all the ones we'll talk about in this one here. The main thing to realize is when we talk about digestion, there is digestive organs that have endocrine function. We talk about blood vessels in the heart. The heart has endocrine functions. The reproductive tracts have endocrine functions. So we'll talk about some of these classic organs in this one, but again, we will come back to other things that do some of that endocrine function in another system. So in reality, the endocrine system, in a pretty simple sense, you have the main control region of the brain that is doing this, that is called the hypothalamus. It's kind of on the lower part of what is called the diencephalon. There is a little stalk that drops down into a little region in the brain, the skull, called the sella turcica. It's this little indentation. Within that indentation, there's the pituitary gland. What we're going to see a lot of what goes on here is the hypothalamus is going to cause the pituitary to release different hormones, which then act on a third endocrine area of the body. So in this example, the thyroid. And again, there is a lot of feedback in these systems. When the endocrine organ finally makes its particular hormone, that might feed back to the pituitary or the hypothalamus to try to regulate what the system is doing or what the levels of the particular hormone are. So the hypothalamus is generally telling the pituitary what to do. We'll see in a little bit, there is what is called the anterior and posterior pituitary. These are controlled in different ways by the hypothalamus. Some of it is through the use of hormones, some of it is through nerve impulses. But the pituitary then a lot of times acts on other glands. We talk about it being tropic hormones. These are hormones that act on other endocrine organs. And a lot of times this pituitary is going to act on, let's say, the thyroid and cause it to release this particular hormone. When you get down to that one, it releases a particular hormone which has its action and again feeds back up to the system to make sure we are keeping these levels where we want them to be. So like it says here, hypothalamus is kind of like a CEO. We don't do a lot with this one because, again, it's just generally releasing hormones or nerve impulses, regulating a lot of this. But it is what is telling the pituitary what to do. It's like a chief operating officer who is really the one that's in charge here, telling which gland to do what thing. And again, lots of feedback loops in here where these hormones that are getting kicked out are feeding back up to the control areas of this and making sure we can regulate these tightly and keep pretty much whatever that hormone is doing somewhat regulated, so we're not overexpressing it or underexpressing it. Things like hypothyroidism both can cause issues, for example. So the pituitary gland is probably, a lot of times they refer to this as the master gland of the endocrine system. This is located, like it says there, in the sphenoid bone. There's this little indentation called the sella turcica, which actually means is Latin for Turkish saddle, which if you actually look at the bone region and you look at an actual Turkish saddle, you'll see that they look a lot alike. But it is connected through this little stalk to the hypothalamus, and again, is going to be regulating a lot of the rest of the endocrine system. And in this first show, we're just going to kind of deal with the pituitary gland and its main regions and some of the main cell types within it, hormones it makes, what are the actions of those, and then in the subsequent couple of shows, we will look at a couple different endocrine organs outside of the pituitary. So pituitary is almost like two, well, in reality, it's more like 6 or 7 glands in one. But it has two main lobes to it. You have what is called the anterior pituitary or adenohypophysis, and you have the posterior pituitary or neurohypophysis. And this is actually a dissected version of it. You can see the scale on the top there. It's not a particularly huge gland. When we do this in A&P, you can a lot of times see it on a little stalk underneath the brain. And you can see here is this pituitary stalk. It is this little connection that keeps it connected to the hypothalamus. Again, not much doing that. That's part of the reason a lot of times when you dissect these, it's very easy to actually sever this, really easy. And you can kind of see, and we'll get into a little bit more depth on this in just a minute, but you can see the left side of the screen versus the right side of the screen. There is a distinct difference in the histology, and that is the left side of the screen would be the anterior pituitary, the right side would be the posterior pituitary. We're going to see there's a lot more nervous tissue in the posterior pituitary. Because of that, a lot more myelin coating on this, not as much staining, where there's a much more epithelial and glandular look to the anterior pituitary, and we're going to see it's making a good majority of the hormones that we're going to talk about with this. So the anterior pituitary, again, glandular epithelial cells, there's a good capillary bed to this. We're going to see this makes a bunch of different hormones. There is a few different regions to this. You have what's called the pars distalis, which is the main body of that anterior pituitary. You got this pars tuberalis, which is helping make part of the stalk. And then you have what's called the pars intermedia, which makes one particular hormone. A lot of times we talk about this being the middle pituitary, but it's separating those two different halves. And again, can be a little bit distinct histology-wise. Makes something called melanocyte stimulating hormone. So again, if we're looking at this right here, you can see you have the pars distalis is that region in front. You can see the pars tuberalis is making part of that stalk, wraps around part of the pars nervosa, which is the posterior pituitary. And then you can see the pars intermedia is that dividing line that's in between. And if you look at the upper box here, you can see that this is on a little stalk that's dropped right down beneath that hypothalamus. So this is looking at a section, if you were to kind of be looking from the brain down at the anterior and posterior pituitary, you can see the anterior pituitary is quite a bit larger than the posterior lobe. Again, very low power view on this one. We can now see this cut from more of a side view. Again, still low power view. You can see the stalk is really the combination of that pars nervosa and that tuberalis going up. You can see the pars intermedia is that dividing line, and then, like I said, the pars distalis is really the main body of the anterior pituitary, where we call the posterior pituitary the pars nervosa. Again, mainly nervous tissue, hence its name. So again, if we look a little bit more zoomed in at the anterior pituitary, you can see that it is very much similar to a lot of glands we've seen before. Epithelial groups together. Again, we don't see the blood vessels that much in here. There is a capillary beds throughout this. Not any ducts in these ones, so you're not going to see a lumen there, but you can see groups of these glandular epithelial cells kind of next to one another. The other thing you notice on here is there's some darker pink staining ones and some lighter pink staining ones and some ones that don't take much stain at all. Those are going to be 3 of the main cell types that we're going to take a look at in this anterior pituitary. And again, things to know, some of those main regions like we were just talking about on the last slide, the pars tuberalis versus the intermedia versus the pars nervosa and the rest of that. That is all stuff I would say would be fair game, as well as the 3 cell types we're going to talk about are all stuff I would say I'd expect you to be able to look at and know what they are. So if we zoom in on this a little bit more, you can kind of see the anterior pituitary. It really has three main cell types. You have these acidophils, basophils, and chromophobes. The acidophils staining a little bit pinker, basophils a little bit less, and then the chromophobes, hence the name, don't take in much stain. And we're going to see the anterior pituitary makes about 6 different hormones. The middle pituitary makes 1, and then we have 2 that are stored in the posterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary makes growth hormone, prolactin, one that's called follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. We have luteinizing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, very commonly called ACTH, and then thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. What these are doing, like it says there, very simplified study, summary of this. Growth hormone does a lot of what it says here. Growth hormone is released especially through our younger years, but even throughout life. It aids in the growth of bones and the growth of muscle. Prolactin is a little bit more specific to developing the mammary glands for lactation. Follicle and stimulating hormone are both part of regulating reproductive function. So in the females, FSH helps to stimulate production of the egg cells or ovarian follicles, helps to stimulate the sperm cell formation in the males. Luteinizing hormone, again, aids in the second half of this and leads to progesterone secretion in the female. In males, this is going to act on what are called interstitial cells that we'll see when we get to that chapter, that are involved in releasing testosterone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone acts on the adrenal cortex, so the outer part of the adrenal gland, something that we'll look at in the last of the endocrine lectures here. We're going to see it has 3 layers to it, and this is going to trigger the release of some of the hormones from those layers. And then finally, thyroid stimulating hormone does exactly what it says. It stimulates the thyroid to release particular thyroid hormones. Again, if you're looking at this here, you can see the acidophils stain pinker, the basophils a little bit more in that purpley color there, sometimes not as dark as it's shown here. You can see the acidophils in reality are mainly making growth hormone and prolactin, where the basophils do FSH, LH, ACTH, and TSH. Again, I don't think I'm gonna go to that level and ask you what are the acidophils and basophils specifically make. I do want you to be able to identify these when we look at them, but I mean, to me, not a bad thing to know on this one. Easy way to remember it is the basophils B flat, so they do FSH, LH, ACTH, and TSH. So if you can remember the note B flat, that would tell you it's basophils and the 4 hormones that they make. The posterior pituitary, on the other hand, is almost all axons, so again, doesn't stain that much. The main part of this we call the pars nervosa. Again, that's where all these hormones are. They're technically made in the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary. It's going to be nerve impulses that cause their release. You have what's called the median eminence on the bottom of that hypothalamus, and then you have this infundibular stalk, which is part of that pars nervosa traveling up to the hypothalamus where all those axons are. So you can again see the infundibulum right here, that median eminence at the bottom of this, and again, main thing here, pars nervosa at the back side. And again, if you look at here, the histology section, you can see the stalk, the main body of the pars nervosa in the back. Again, if we zoom in on this a little bit more, to me, I don't really make you differentiate different cell types within this one. To me, you need to know that this is posterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary, we're going to identify the 3 different cell types that are in it. Posterior pituitary, knowing it's mainly the posterior pituitary is the main thing here. You can see there's lots of axons in these glial cells. There's really what all those nuclei are coming from. There is some cells called herring bodies that are in there. Again, not anything I'm really going to go after. And as I was already kind of saying, the posterior pituitary does not actually make its hormones. It stores them. They're actually made in the hypothalamus. And again, these herring bodies are these parts of these axons that are storing a large amount of these hormones. Two hormones that it makes are called antidiuretic hormone, which, if you know what a diuretic is, it leads to urination. Antidiuretic hormone is actually going to inhibit you from making more urine. It helps you to reabsorb water, helps maintain water balance. The other one is oxytocin, which you will see does a number of different things. Antidiuretic hormone, like I said, water reabsorption to the kidney. Oxytocin, really involved a lot of times with smooth muscle contraction, again, more related to reproductive organs, so contraction of the uterus during childbirth, as well as lactation. It causes the letdown of the milk during suckling. It is kind of interesting that oxytocin does do a lot of other things as well, so it is part of that pair bonding and mother to infant bonding. So releases of oxytocin will actually stimulate that idea of pair bonding, helps increase kind of that mental connection with somebody else. So kind of an interesting one on that one. You can kind of see, if we're looking at the the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, it is regulated by what is called the hypophyseal portal system. So what's going on in this one? You have releasing hormones that are released from the hypothalamus. They can travel down and cause the release of those anterior pituitary hormones. So, and again, a portal system is two capillary beds. If you're coming from the heart, you go through two separate capillary beds before you go back to the heart. And this, you can see there's a capillary bed here, and these portal veins that will take the releasing hormones down to the anterior pituitary, act on their target cells here, which causes the release of a particular anterior pituitary hormone. Where the posterior pituitary, it is nerve impulse from the hypothalamus, is going to trigger the release of these particular hormones into the bloodstream. So, like I was saying, the anterior pituitary, it is almost entirely releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. We have these hormones that will stimulate the release of a particular anterior pituitary hormone, and a second hormone in a lot of cases that will inhibit the release of that particular hormone. Again, as these are being made, it's going to feed back up to that hypothalamus and make sure that we're kicking out the hormones at the particular level that the hypothalamus is wanting us to. Too much will turn it off. Not enough will cause us to release more of this. So what we'll take a look at on the slides here is we're going to look at the anterior pituitary and make sure we can identify those different cell types, anterior versus posterior pituitary, and some of the basic structures of that as well. Two quick looks at a couple different slides here to look at the pituitary. The first one here is just kind of more of a zoomed out version of the pituitary. It's at 20x. It doesn't show you a good posterior pituitary on this one, but you can see the infundibular stalk coming down right here. Part of that pars tuberalis wrapping up right there. You can see the pars distalis, or the anterior pituitary, right there. On this image, the posterior pituitary, if it was still there, would be about somewhere back here. And you can see the middle pituitary, or the pars intermedia, through that section right there. Again, I wasn't able to find a slide that showed all the parts on that one, at least on this slide box here. I might take a look and see if I can find another one and add that into this. The other one here, this is just looking at the anterior and the posterior pituitary. Again, on this one, you can kind of see that more glandular side on the right here. That would be the anterior pituitary, or pars distalis. Pars nervosa would be on this side right here. And again, you can see a slightly different through the center right here is the pars intermedia. So what I'm going to do is zoom in on the area I'd already kind of picked out. So this is zooming in on some of these cells in the anterior pituitary. The main thing you're looking at in these ones is you really have two main cell types that you're looking at. You're going to have your acidophils and basophils. So these pinker ones right here are going to be the acidophils. These ones out here are going to be more the basophils. And you can see this cell right here where there's not much of any staining in its cytoplasm. That would probably be a chromophobe. What they think chromophobes are is just one that either has degranulated or one that is a stem cell that hasn't quite got to being an acidophil or a basophil yet. Probably another example of a chromophobe would be right over here. But again, Acidophils are the darker pink. The basophils are going to be these ones here that are a little bit lighter in color, sometimes stain a little bit more blue. If we then kind of scroll ourselves over to the posterior pituitary, again, you can see mainly these nuclei and other things like that. Again, I don't think I would expect you to try to do a herring body or anything else like that, but these are mainly neuroglial cells and axons that are present in this one. But if I showed you this, I do expect you to be able to look at this and say, hey, this is actually the posterior pituitary. I figured I could try to find one more slide on one of the other slide boxes that maybe would show you the overall pituitary structure a little bit better. This one kind of does that. So you can kind of see here, this would be that pars nervosa and the infundibulum going up this side right here. Here's the pars disalis. You can see the blue is kind of making up that pars intermedia. Pars tuberalis is this part going up right along the side here. Again, just giving you a little better look at the overall pituitary gland structure.